Welcome, Paul and Azim. I'm excited about today and our conversation. So what we'll do is we'll do some quick introductions. I'm Scott Webb, Senior Vice President, Business Development and Strategy here at Gateway Health Partners. Something I want to share with you before we introduce Azim and Paul is, I grew up in Hawaii, and something special when I was growing up is we always said, let's talk story, whether it was with friends, business events, lunch, dinner. It was always about let's talk story, meaning let's have a conversation, let's get to know one another, let's learn something, and let's keep that aloha spirit going. So I'll kick it over to Azim to introduce himself and then to Paul.
Thank you very much, Scott. My name is Azim Bari. I am a pharmacist. I am the Chief Clinical Officer here at Gateway Health Partners. I've been with the organization for 8 years and have been in the PBM managed care space for approximately 20 years at this point. And I look forward to the conversation with you, Scott and Paul.
Great. My name is Paul Fisher. I'm the Director of Clinical Formulary Strategy at Vital One, and happy to have a conversation today about biosimilars.
Well, look forward to talking to you both. So let's get started. So the first question I'm going to kick over to Azim, to actually Paul first and then Azim. So the misconceptions of biosimilars in the market today. From your perspective, what's the most misunderstood aspect of biosimilar adoption in today's market? A lot of complexities, a lot of confusion. If you can kind of kick us off, Paul, that'd be great.
Sure. I think it's a multi-layered issue in terms of misunderstanding or misconceptions of access, effectiveness, and costs. In terms of effectiveness, because these are not considered true generic drugs in the sense that, pharmacists like myself grew up with, they're a little bit different. That's why they're called biosimilars. So with that, in the general public, there's definitely a knowledge gap there in terms of how patients come to know about them. And, there's a lot of rumors and information going around that may not be true that they hear regarding these products. And so having the patient be educated as well as the provider is definitely a gap that I see. People also have misconceptions about the effectiveness of these medications, and a lot of that goes to the approval process for these medications and how it wasn't just the FDA's hand in these drugs getting approved. It was also via litigation pathways with the reference manufacturers, and how things sometimes took a stepwise approach in terms of what indications were approved and when for these products. So the good news is that there's a number of fully interchangeable products now in the market for these reference products. So that helps from an effectiveness standpoint, but then that goes back to the misconceptions part and trying to get both providers and patients educated that these drugs are just as effective as the originator product. And the other one that I mentioned was costs. There's been a lot of different ways that these drugs have come onto the market. Some have been high cost with costs that were close to what the originator products were, as well as ones that have come to the market that are super low cost. And so people are confused. Is this a high cost product? Is it a low cost product? And then I used to get manufacturer assistance that help reduce my copay. How did that all work out? Or how will it work out if I switch over to one of these products? So those are my three big hurdles that I think people have to go through in order to accept that these products are as great as they really are.
And Paul, let me ask you, great response. The market is shifting at a fast pace. The complexities are real. You mentioned rumors. How do these rumors get started, and where does that swirl come from your perspective? And how do we control some of that?
Well, yeah, no, that's a great question. I think a lot of it just has to do with the world that we live in and how connected everyone is, whether it's through TikTok videos or editorials. The news sources aren't just the traditional
Right.
ABC, CBS, NBC, for the people that don't have cable news, and then the newspaper. I mean, there is news everywhere, and trying to figure out, what's fact from fiction or opinion is, I think, a hard thing for people these days. And, it's definitely an acquired skill. So that, I think, is probably one of the biggest reasons why things can swirl so fast in one direction. Even, a topic for another day, looking at GLP-1s and the stir that social media created with those products. It's just nothing short of fascinating. So that's where I think the biggest culprit from that. And then also going back to what I said earlier about the way these things rolled out onto the market, where they came out and only one indication was approved in relation to the reference product that had 10, 11, 12 indications. So those are, big questions that people have. Well, why did this start out with only one indication and now it's fully interchangeable? How does that work? And then trying to work backwards to figure that out. The regular consumer, doesn't have time for that. They have to live their regular life and try to figure out, how they're going to pay for their medications.
Well, Paul, thank you. Azim, what would you like to add to what Paul was just discussing, and from your perspective?
All great points Paul made. I would just add, one of the other big misconceptions that patients and physicians and even payers are not always comfortable with at this point was the point that Paul mentioned at the very end there. Why are some products interchangeable when we're talking about biosimilars while others aren't? I know that's one topic we'll get into in a little bit here, but that, I think, is a huge area of misconception and confusion, and a reason for hesitation for further adoption of biosimilars. Another point I would like to mention is, and this one's a little bit odd, is just really the availability of products. Paul touched on it a little bit, saying that some products are approved, based on indication, based on strength and concentration. But I think another aspect of that is that we have a lot of things in play behind the scenes where we might have a product that's approved officially on paper, but it may not be launching for many months or even years due to maybe deals that have been made with the originator manufacturer and things of that nature. So I think there's a lot of confusion and frustration on the part of the patients and physicians as well as payers that just because something's approved, it's not readily available in the marketplace. And the second piece of that is just because something is available or there's multiple biosimilars available, I think everyone thinks that it's kind of like going to Walmart. You can easily go ahead and get whatever product you need. There is a huge element of, will this product be available to everyone in ample supply and be able to supply the entire market? And I think that's a key decision factor that a lot of payers consider when choosing the biosimilar that they want to put on formulary. And again, I know that's a topic we'll get into a little bit later, but I think that's another thing that many prescribers in particular are very confused by, is that all products are not always readily available.
So great response, Azim. So we need a pocket Azim and Paul, but most people don't have access to that. So what's a good source or place to go to get more information and to make sure you're on the right track?
Oh, I can kick this one off. I think I'm going to steal your answer, Scott. We service, both Paul and I service many clients, have relationships with clients that are payers. So we make ourselves available and our teams available to have these frank conversations because, as Paul mentioned too, there is a significant amount of misinformation out there due to social media, due to people that you run into at your kids' play that think they know what's going on in the space, and sometimes even physicians being misinformed or maybe misinterpreting things that are being said by market access or drug reps that are coming into their office because they're very busy. It's very easy to misunderstand what's being communicated. But folks like Paul and I are here to help our clients who are dealing with members and patients to filter through a lot of that noise and make sense of it all so that you can strategize appropriately to meet your pharmaceutical goals.
Thank you, Azim. I love that response. So let's shift gears a little bit to the next question. And Azim, I'm going to start with you. So how biosimilars and generic drugs are different? So can you briefly describe how biosimilars are different than generic drugs?
Absolutely. And I'm going to start off very high level here. When we're
Right.
talking about generics and generics are copying brand drugs, we're typically talking about what's known as the traditional pharmacy benefit. These are going to be chemically derived drugs for generally very common uses and indications, such as blood pressure medications, cholesterol medications, and they're sometimes referred to as small molecule. A long way of saying they're easy to make, easy to copy. And when the FDA approves generics, they say, hey, you're just copying a brand that's pretty easy to make chemically. You don't have to do a whole bunch of tests to show that, to allow us to approve that. They actually require an abbreviated new drug application for a generic to be approved just because it's copying something that's very easy to copy. However, for biologics, this is what we're talking about when we're referring to specialty pharmacy, especially pharmacy benefits. So you have biologic drugs, and biosimilars are copies of those reference or the first biologic drug. And biologic drugs, as the name implies, are biologically derived, not chemically derived. So they're coming from an animal source, maybe derived from some bacteria or a virus vector. So it's very different. And the molecule is referred to as a large or complex molecule. So the approval process for these biologically driven drugs is significantly more complicated, lengthy, and more expensive than it is for traditional pharmacy. So when we're comparing biosimilars, copies of reference biologic products, their process is also significantly longer, where they have to show that the drug acts and behaves the way it's supposed to in the body. And if they want to get interchangeability status, which is, I would say a favorable factor for a biosimilar, they have to go through some additional studies, sometimes called switching studies, where they're compared to the biologic, switched back and forth to ensure that there's no diminishing of the effectiveness of the drug and that there's no increase in side effects. So the biosimilars have a significantly higher barrier in terms of getting approval relative to the reference biologic or the first biologic that it's copying than the generics do having to get approval versus their traditional brand originator product.
So, Paul, switching gears a little bit, going into the next set of questions. So, we talk about interchangeable biosimilars, the utilization. What impacts do you foresee from the standpoint of utilization of interchangeable biosimilars? It's a high cost, therapeutic class like oncology.
Sure. Yes. Definitely. Whenever you have that designation, that's going to take care of one of the biggest hurdles in getting provider and patient acceptance for those particular medications. As time has gone on, as we've seen with the existing biosimilar products, they have continued to pick up those indications to become fully interchangeable across 100% of indications for those biosimilars that are available. The other thing that we've also seen as time has gone on, and it's not even been that long a time, it's been really in the last 2 or 3 years when all of this has really exploded, is that the manufacturers that are coming to market are coming to market with a higher proportion of indications covered or 100% interchangeability at launch, because everyone learned from the early launches for the Humira biosimilars that the products that did not have interchangeability or the ones that took longer to get interchangeability struggled to get market share, despite being an effective drug that was safe for those particular indications for patients.
Paul, thanks. You mentioned provider and patient acceptance. Azim, what's your thoughts around that?
I think things are starting to change. The term interchangeability, where you can basically fill the biosimilar product if it's deemed interchangeable by the FDA at the point of sale without having to call the doctor and switch the prescription. It's a huge deal. Paul just talked about it. We saw it with Humira. He's exactly right, and it's a very important attribute to any biosimilar that's hitting the marketplace. One very interesting development that's started to happen over the last year or so is that the FDA has acknowledged, we shouldn't have such a high barrier to adopting interchangeable products. So they're currently working out a framework with the pharmaceutical manufacturers on how to more quickly bring interchangeable products to market. so that we don't have this long drawn out process like we saw with Humira. And I think they're not rushing it for no good reason. The science is there. They've looked at all of the data. There's really not much concern, as Paul just alluded to, with many of the biosimilars. So they're going to make that runway to become interchangeable much more short. And that will help accelerate the comfortability that a lot of patients and prescribers currently are lacking with some of the biosimilars. Because if they see something's interchangeable, they'll say, hey, not only is it biosimilar, it's been deemed interchangeable. I feel comfortable with this. There's an additional stamp of approval on this product.
So looking ahead, what's your take on the upcoming pipeline of products in this class? And, how is that going to impact the dynamics in formulary management?
Absolutely. So I think the pipeline for biologic drugs that are going to lose patent over the next 10 years is exciting. But there's a dose of caution, which I'll come back to at the end. So right now, it's looking like 118 biologics will lose patent protection over the next decade or so, which equates to about $232 billion in potential annualized spend. But we know all of that is not necessarily opportunity. And here's the caution part. Of those 118 biologics, at this point, we only have 12 of those drugs or of those entities that have biosimilars that are lined up and in development. So we have a huge gap of products that, will lose patent, but we don't have biosimilars lined up quite yet, ready to have a product onto the market or in development to have a product on the market. And that's concerning. It is due to some reasons that make sense. These biosimilar manufacturers do have concerns that will they see an ROI on their investment if they create a biosimilar? Because you have to assess, is there a significant market? Because these biologic drugs are usually for smaller disease states, and not always rare, but we're talking things like multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, oncology, not blood pressure and cholesterol, where you have a huge patient population. They also have to assess, is it worth the cost of building these very expensive manufacturing facilities that are very expensive to run, that are required by, the FDA is going to inspect them to ensure that the factories are up to code to produce these biologic products. And is it worth going through the long, costly, drawn out clinical testing process to get the approval? So these are reasonable headwinds that these manufacturers have. But we're hoping as the biosimilar space becomes a lot more active, that we are past that inflection point where patients and prescribers are becoming more comfortable with these products. We're hoping that more manufacturers will come to the table and start showing interest in providing biosimilars for all of these biologics that are going to be losing patent over the next 10 years. I think the next couple of years are very interesting. You mentioned pipeline. I think there's a couple of drugs that we can talk about, and we can really break it down by year. 2025, the big news this year was Stelara and the Stelara biosimilar, but we're also going to see Simponi, Prolia, and Xgeva recently had biosimilars. That accounts for almost $18.5 billion in annualized spend. The next big event will probably be in 2028, where we see some of these oncology checkpoint inhibitors, Keytruda and Opdivo. Keytruda being the number one drug in the world right now, which amounts to about $27 billion in annualized spend between those two. And then in 29, we'll see Cosentyx, Enbrel, and Ocrevus, $16.5 billion. And then in 2030, we'll see Taltz lose patent, which is about $3.2 billion in annualized spend. So there's a lot of opportunity for drugs with a lot of use, large patient populations that will be losing patent in the near future. And I think similar to, again, different than generics, but similar to generics, I think this will be a great opportunity for additional players to come into the market, some innovations to be made to drive down the cost of these products, and hopefully the FDA can work things out with pharma to lower the administrative cost to bring these drugs to market. And if we're able to see that, they'll promote competition. We'll be able to extract a lot of value out of the drug chain, the value chain, so that patients will have access and payers will have access to that capital to redeploy towards the next generation of immunologics and the next generation of oncology agents. Because the current generation of oncology agents, for example, have really worked miracles. We've gone to we're at a point now where the 5-year survival for cancer is almost 70%. If you look back a couple of decades ago, that's almost unheard of. And we have a significant number of patients that are now walking around as survivors of cancer. Approximately 18 million patients walking around as cancer survivors. I think if you look back a few decades ago, that would not have been achievable without the early detection that we have today, as well as these next generation therapies that we have, which again are going to be losing patent and hopefully freeing up some value to invest in the next generation, which hopefully will continue to swerve that survival curve in the right direction.
Azim, I really like the stats. Before I have Paul jump in here, 232 billion, 118 biologics, 12 in development. When you look at formulary management, what do we really need to focus on? What are some of the pain points, and what do we need to stay ahead of from your perspective?
Well, I hate to say it, but you went through a lot of difficulty in the last couple of years with the conversion from Humira. A lot of lessons were learned, both on the side of the payers, but also with patients and prescribers. I think we're all aligned here, every single one of us, that we want to ensure that patients have access to the most cost-effective therapies, as do payers. Because unfortunately, with everything that's going on in the pharmaceutical space and in healthcare in general, costs aren't going down; they're going the other way. So we have to be able to pull every lever that's clinically appropriate in order to ensure that we have the resources to pay for the next generation of therapies that are coming out. So I think we are headed in the right direction. And I can say this, our organization, Vital One, have embraced biosimilars, and I think it's key to say that it's a very dynamic space. You don't want to paint with a broad brush and say, hey, we're always going to pick the first biosimilar that hits the market. That's the one. No, I think it's very, very important to say we're going to analyze the market as the product or biosimilar products hit the market, see what the lowest cost products are from a net perspective, assess other attributes such as availability. Will they be on the market? Will they be on the shelves for pharmacists to dispense? And make a decision and provide biosimilar options to patients and prescribers now that they're more comfortable with it than they have been in the past. And I think we're headed absolutely in the right direction in that regard and doing the right thing for patients, payers, and prescribers.
Azim, thank you very much. You mentioned Vital One, which kicks right over to you, Paul. That was a lot of information. Give us your take on things from your perspective and lens, and take it from there.
So, Scott, that's a great question. I think Azim nailed it. You said 100% of what I would have. The one thing that I would expand on, though, would be in terms of the biosimilar manufacturers, there have been a few notable ones, especially the ones that were some of the stronger entrants for the Humira biosimilars that have really come to embrace the research and development and then wanting to really stake their claim in the biosimilar market. So I look at that as a very large glimmer of hope for the future to help cut into that deficit that Azim was talking about in terms of the drugs that have biosimilars approved versus the ones that don't for the future. And, having had some conversations with those manufacturers about their commitment, that to me is really exciting for the near, mid, and long-term future for these products.
So, Paul and Azim, as we wrap this up, I have a question. I'll start with you, Paul. If you look at the next 12 months, what's a major shift in this space that you predict could take place or is already starting to kind of percolate and could see full steam coming here soon?
Sure. I would go back to a lot of what we talked about already in terms of, an easy prediction to make, and that's going to be the more generalized acceptance of the mainstream biosimilars for Humira and Stelara with a lot of the moves that the industry has made on the pharmacy benefit management side, where we're going to see a very, very large percentage of those members that are currently on those two reference products being moved over to the biosimilars. And I think with that, people are going to help to start see the fact from the fiction or, throw away misconceptions that they have about those products as more and more people come to utilize them. And they're going to see that, the FDA was exactly right, in labeling these products as 100% interchangeable with the same effectiveness and side effect profiles that the reference products had. So that's my easy softball crystal ball answer.
It's not easy.
In
That
terms
was
of,
excellent. Oh, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, in thinking towards the future, though, the other thing that I feel that will be a major component is that, as we've already seen in the last couple years with how things picked up steam with Humira, it's already been exponentially faster in terms of Stelara. And so the other prediction that I would have is that as each one of these new biosimilars comes to market for a new reference product, we're going to see that timeline compressed or shorter and shorter with each new biosimilar that hits the market.
Great. Thanks, Paul. So Azim, don't hold back. I want to hear
I'll,
what the great impact's going to be.
I'll give you two controversial takes. The first one that I have is I do have significant concerns, not only for biologics and biosimilars, but just in terms of the whole ecosystem with some of what's gone on with the FDA recently, specifically referring to the staffing shortages and the staffing cuts we've seen since the beginning of the year. And it's not just a take that I'm saying based on what we see all see in the media, but for all of us that are in this space, Paul, we've seen the missed approval dates and delays in getting drugs approved that had certain dates. FDA rarely did that previously, and we've already had a few this year. And I think that there's going to be some spillover potentially when we're talking about approval for generics and then biosimilars as well. And that concerns me. As a healthcare provider, I want patients to have access to not only novel therapies in an expedient manner, but also biosimilars and generics, which will save them money and improve access to care in an expedient manner. And I think that there might be a risk there now, just because of some of what's going on at the FDA. Hopefully they get that rectified and turn that around. But that is my concern for the next 12 months and maybe beyond. The second thing I want to mention, as far as the dynamics specific to the biologic and biosimilar space, is, initially we had quite a few manufacturers come to the plate to produce biosimilars for Humira and Stelara. However, Paul alluded to this a little bit, is we have had a handful of winners. There were some that really embraced biosimilars, had ample supply, got interchangeability, did everything right. But we saw some of the other players slowly start to bow out. They either transfer rights to their product to an offshore manufacturer or have gotten out of space completely. I hope that's a one-off. And maybe there were just too many people that rushed the market, more so than the market could bear. But I do have some concerns that we'll have some manufacturers, especially small and mid-sized manufacturers, saying, you know what, we can't do this. We're not getting the access. We're not seeing a return on investment. We're going to drop out. And that concerns me a little bit because, value comes from competition. I want this to be a very competitive, healthy marketplace to produce cost-effective and safe biosimilars, and not one where we just have a handful of biosimilar players. So I think we as payers and formulary managers can do our part by ensuring that we give all manufacturers an equal shot when researching, reviewing, analyzing, and then providing them the feedback so that they can try to find a niche and access for their products so we maintain a healthy biosimilar ecosystem.
Azim and Paul, I want to thank you for talking story today, sharing your incredible insights on the misconceptions of biosimilars and generics, kind of the market shifts, what you see impacts are, and when they're coming. And I look forward to further conversations, and I appreciate you both for joining today. Thank you.